Let's understand the world a little better. I'm your host, Timo Wunderlich, and with me is Martin Dimitrov. He's a professor at Tulane University and an associate at Harvard, and the author of Dictatorship and Information. Let me dive right in. I want to ask you, what is the dictator's dilemma? That sounds interesting.
Yes, thank you. So the dictator's dilemma is really the motivation for writing this book. There is a large body of literature in political science that argues that dictators are fundamentally unable to collect information that allows them to evaluate what level of opposition they face from society and what level of support they have in society. So as a result of this inability to collect information about popular support and popular opposition, the theory argues they over-repress and under-redistribute public goods. So dictators have two tools at their disposal to govern. One is repression, the other one is distribution of public goods. So because they have inaccurate information, they cannot accurately target repression and redistribution. And as a result, according to this theory of the dictator's dilemma, dictatorships are brittle and short-lived. And this is true, except that it's not. So there are some regimes, and this is the motivation for my book, namely single-party communist regimes that enjoy a very long average lifespan, therefore suggesting that they have found ways to mitigate or perhaps even solve the dictator's dilemma.
Why are usually these regimes unable to collect data? I mean, I would assume not the only option is from elections, right?
Yeah, no, so this is the theory, and then what I show in my book is that although this theory is very influential, there's no empirical support for it. The dictator's dilemma is an argument that emerged. It's something that in political science we call a stylized fact, something that we all assume is true, even if there's not that much empirical support for it. As to why it emerged, I think that's a big question. I mean, it was a convenient way to think about dictatorships at a time when it was very difficult to get a sense of their inner workings. But this theory emerges in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and then in more recent decades, there are newer interpretations of authoritarian rule, which argue that actually the dictator's dilemma can be solved, and there are various mechanisms for doing that. One, of course, is the elections that you mentioned, Timon. And where I stand on elections is I argue that, of course, they reveal information about levels of popular support, but this information is revealed both to the dictator and to the masses. So if they realize that the dictator is unpopular, they can engage in collective action and subvert the regime. So this is not a mechanism that dictatorships favor. They want other mechanisms. Another mechanism that reveals information, but again, not only to the dictator, but also to discontented citizens, is opinion polling. I'm fairly skeptical about opinion polling, but when it works, it actually does tell the dictator what his level of support is, but this information is transmitted to the masses as well. And then finally, there is an argument, a relatively recent argument, that dictators would encourage investigative journalism in order to solve this information problem. And where I come on that is I argue that if this investigative journalism takes place in the publicly available media, again, this information travels upwards to regime insiders, but it also travels horizontally to discontented citizens who can use it to engage in collective action. So what I'm arguing in my book is that dictators favor avenues that are internal. These are secret channels for the collection of information, and they allow for the privileged transmission of information to regime insiders rather than to both insiders and the general masses.
Why does that information necessarily get through to the masses? When I do an opinion poll, why does the mass find out about the results?
Well, because normally these opinion polls are published. I mean, the results are published in various outlets, whether it's scholarly research or in the media. Now, of course, there's secret opinion polls, and those have been practiced in autocracies. So the opinion poll itself may be a mechanism that is used, But what dictators do not want is publicly available opinion polls. The same holds for the investigative journalism. So, I mean, investigative journalism in the publicly available media, this is not something that dictators want. But in dictatorships, they are secret, they're classified newspapers, which are meant for regime insiders. So in those, in the internal ones, they do encourage investigative journalism. They just don't want the masses to know about what is discovered and what is transmitted to the leadership.
Now, how do democracies, for example, get their information? Just the ways we just mentioned, opinion polls and etc., or?
Well, one answer that I could give is that I don't really work on democracies, but of course I do have opinions about democracies. So, I mean, there's certain aspects of authoritarian institutions for collection of information and of democratic institutions that overlap. You know, one of the things that I spend a lot of time in my book studying is the secret police. So, of course, there are intelligence agencies both in democracies and in autocracies. And one, of course, hopes, and how realistic that hope is a separate question. One hopes that in a democracy, citizens are protected from illegal collection of information about them, and in autocracies, this is not the case. So, leaving this aside, intelligence agencies, both in democracies and autocracies, operate in roughly similar ways, right? They need staff, they need technology, and they need informants. Now, as to who they target, I mean, this of course differs from autocracies to democracies. They're secretive in both autocracies and democracies. And in fact, you know, something that became clear to me as in the process of writing my book is that we know a lot more about intelligence agencies in autocracies than in democracies, because a lot of these autocracies have collapsed and we now have information about how the intelligence agencies worked. And in democracies, for various reasons, intelligence agencies continue to be shrouded in a lot more secrecy. Of course, there's Freedom of Information Act in the US, but using it to get information on intelligence agencies is complicated. There have been, there's Snowden, there have been various other leaks. But in general, we do happen to know more about how these entities operate in autocracies. So, you know, one parallel is the intelligence agencies. Opinion polling exists in both democracies and autocracies. It's much more accurate in democracies because, you know, one problem that emerges in autocracies is the so-called preference falsification, where citizens are afraid of sharing their actual views about the dictator. So if they're asked a direct question, the answer may not be honest. So this is one reason why, although opinion polling was practiced in autocracies, the secret opinion polling that I talked about, dictators did not really attach too much value to it because they did not believe in the findings, because the findings suggested that the Communist Party and the dictator have a very high approval rating, and there were other indicators that suggested otherwise. But this is a parallel. So intelligence agencies and opinion polling is something that exists in both settings. Something that is of great interest to me is complaints. So again, I mean, citizens, when they complain, they actually reveal their opinions, because a complaint is a request for service. You're unhappy, you being the citizen of an authoritarian state, you're unhappy about the provision of some type of service, or you want some type of benefit from the state, and you're not going to lie about what you want. Now, I mean, complaints exist in democracies as well, but this is usually not how people get what they want. So sometimes, you know, the actual avenues may be fairly similar, but the frequency of the usage differs, and certainly this public versus classified aspect of the transmission of information also differs between autocracies and democracies. And finally, because my book is about communist regimes, China being the main case, but I also talk about the East European communist regimes that no longer exist, there is one feature which I feel is unique about the communist regimes, and that is the Communist Party itself. So the Communist Party is a huge machine both for the collection and for the analysis, and then for the transmission of information. So they do, the party does all of these things, collects information on its own. It also receives information from other institutions that engage in the gathering of information, and then it transmits that information to regime insiders. And this is a difference. So of course, in the context of the US, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party collect information, but that information is compared to what the Communist Party collected, minuscule in volume, and it is primarily linked towards assessing the chances of electoral victory. Whereas in communist regimes, elections, they exist, but they're not what communist parties live for. There's all of the governance in between these election cycles, and they need very detailed information in order to engage in sophisticated anticipatory rule, which is something that emerges in communist regimes as they develop over time.
Maybe I didn't quite get this, but did you say in democracies it's more unusual that the public complains?
The public complains, but the issue is, in terms of frequency, what I find in my book is that the frequency of complaints in communist regimes is surprisingly quite high. So this, to me, was an unexpected finding. And the other finding is that as the economic situation deteriorates, the volume of complaints declines and citizens start engaging in protests. So there is this trade-off between complaints and protests. And what communist regimes prefer is complaints to protests, because complaints are they're private, they're individual. Citizens approach the Communist Party or some government agency with a concern, and as long as this concern is resolved, citizens will go about living their lives. If the concern is not resolved, they become more likely to engage in protests. And the communist regimes distinctly dislike protests, so this is something they strongly discourage. But so one consequential difference between communist and democratic regimes is the frequency of complaining. So in a democratic regime, of course, there is the option of complaining, but citizens have many other ways to get the benefits that they want, and complaining is not as frequent.
And the regimes do act upon these complaints.
Yes, although their capacity to act, of course, is constrained. And what is relevant for me is, what are these constraints? So long-lived communist regimes realize that, first of all, they do need the complaints. And secondly, they need to respond to these complaints at a level that is satisfactory. So not every complaint, of course, is read. Not every complaint is responded to. But there is an optimal level of responsiveness. And what is relevant here is that as long as this optimal level of responsiveness is maintained, citizens will continue to participate in the system, and they will continue to complain. And the likelihood of these citizens engaging in protests would be lower. So what I find out in my book, and I documented, is that as responsiveness to complaints declines, then the likelihood of citizens going to the street and engaging in protests goes up. And then the question is, well, if responsiveness is so important, what determines high levels of responsiveness? And I find that one of the primary factors that contribute to high levels of responsiveness is the availability of resources. So what happens is when communist regimes experience economic slowdown, their capacity to respond to these complaints is limited. And this of course occurs in the 1980s in Eastern Europe, but it also occurs in China before 89. So we oftentimes forget that both Eastern Europe and China had their versions of 89, and in both settings there were economic difficulties. So there were economic constraints that limited the capacity of the regime to respond to these complaints. The other finding that I have in my book about responsiveness to complaints is that, of course, it is easier to respond to complaints in a centrally planned communist economy than in a market economy like China today, because the government in China controls a lot of resources, but it doesn't control as much as what was controlled by, for example, the Soviet Union or East Germany or Bulgaria under central planning. These are regimes that I talk about in my book. Yeah, so there are some constraints to responsiveness, and they have to do with the control of economic resources and the overall makeup of the economy.
So this ratio between responses and complaints, is that something that solely you measured, or do you think that also is a ratio that is measured in these regimes?
Oh, I use internal documents on that. So this is not, I mean, this is not something that I myself come up with. And what's relevant is that these internal documents, these are classified archival materials that have now become available to scholars. They themselves record the level of responsiveness. And then they indicate whether this responsiveness is sufficiently high or it's low. So it is from those materials that I come up with these estimates of the optimal level of responsiveness, which seems to be between 30 and 40%. And I don't know what we think about that, right? Because, maybe, if we don't really think about complaints and, what percentage of complaints should result in a positive resolution, we may think that, of course, every single complaint should be analyzed, and it should be responded to, and then once there's a response, it should be a positive response. But actually, this is not how the world works, and this, yeah. So this is what the documents indicate, that 30 to 40 is a reasonable rate. Lower than that is not. And what we observe in China today is that responsiveness to complaints is probably as low as 10%, right? So this is very, very low. And the willingness of citizens to approach the complaint system has been declining, and correspondingly there has been an increase in protests. And what the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government are quite committed to is, first of all, maintaining this complaint system, although some scholars have argued that it should be abolished, and all of these grievances that citizens have should be resolved through the court system. But the Chinese Communist Party is committed to maintaining the system, and it is also committed to increasing the usage of the system, because they understand better than scholars do this relationship between complaints and protests, and they don't want to have a high level of protests, because of course protests can go out of hand, right? That's the issue.
That makes sense. Why don't they hire their why isn't their number high? Why don't they want to change that? I mean, I'm assuming they know similar they have similar ideas like you do have about these numbers. And if they know they're just at 10%, why don't they change that?
Well, because although we might think that a dictator has unlimited power, there are constraints. And the constraints to improving responsiveness in a classic communist regime were, of course, a result of economic. They were a result of the availability of economic resources. In contemporary China, I mean, there are all these arguments that the Chinese economy is slowing down, which of course is true. But I don't think the main constraint in China today is the limited amount of resources. What we do have is a vast country that is in many ways decentralized. So the capacity of the Chinese Communist Party to ensure certain outcomes, especially at the local level, is limited. And that from my point of view is the main constraint. That what we have is, it's a hybrid economy, right? The state is extremely important. I actually don't believe, there's some scholars that think that most economic activity in China comes from private firms. I think there are a lot of firms with mixed ownership, so they're in part private and they're in part public. But even if we think that close to 50% of the activity comes from private firms, then that is 50% of economic activity that the Chinese Communist Party cannot fully control. Of course, it has many levers at its disposal, but it is not able to control it to the extent that economic activity could be controlled during central planning. So the party knows everything that I know, and there are multiple indicators that it is concerned about the volume of complaining, but there's a limit to what it can do. So it is doing certain things, though, and one of them is that the complaints bureaus in China, which had a peculiar control mechanism where they were controlled both by the party and by the government, in the most recent reorganization in March of this year was shifted under full party control. So, of course, the party is more important than the government in China. And what this restructuring is indicating is the ongoing value that the Chinese Communist Party assigns to complaints and its desire to increase their numbers.
Interesting. Do you have numbers for other authoritarian regimes?
On complaints?
Yes, complaint responsiveness.
Yeah, I do. In the book is, although China is the one case that I think most people are interested in, given China's size and its importance, both economically and geopolitically, this is a comparative study. So I do have statistics on complaints in countries like the Soviet Union, East Germany, Bulgaria. I also have some statistics on Cuba. And what I find is that in these classic centrally planned economies, there is a higher level of complaining than there ever was in China, even under central planning, right? Because China, when it had a centrally planned economy in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and for much of the 1980s, because we all think economic reforms begin in the late 1970s, but they don't really get going until after 1989. So for most of this period up to 1989, complaining in China is an urban phenomenon, and the urban population is around 20% of the population. So, citizens that live in rural China do have the option to complain, but they utilize it in much lower numbers. And it's a very different situation in Eastern Europe, where complaining tends to span both the urban and rural divides, and also these societies are much more urbanized. And the other difference is that the welfare state, the socialist welfare state in Eastern Europe, is much more expansive in terms of its commitments to provide various benefits and services to the population. So in China, for complex reasons that have to do with the extent of the socialist welfare state and the relationship between urban and rural populations, just in terms of sheer numbers, the frequency of complaining when we adjust for population, because of course we have to adjust for population, we have to do it per million people, is much lower than it is in Eastern Europe. And then, we do have great shifts of people to urban areas. Currently, most of China's citizens do live in the cities, but the level of complaining has never caught up when we adjust for population with what it was in Eastern Europe. The reason for that has to do with the fact that, currently China does have a market economy, obviously, and the central state is responsible for controlling less of these services and benefits than was the case in the East European regimes during communism. But I also have complaints information on Russia, for instance, contemporary Russia under Putin. And what I find is that complaining persists even in non-communist authoritarian regimes that do have this history of a communist complaint system. And the difference in contemporary Russia when compared to the Soviet Union, for instance, is that complaints to the party are quite limited, right? So the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the main recipient of complaints. What we have in contemporary Russia is that the office of the president of the Russian Federation, so Putin's office, is the main recipient of these complaints. But what's fascinating for me is the nature of these complaints. So to the current day, the most frequent type of complaint in Russia is about benefits and services. Citizens complain about housing. They complain about municipal services. They also complain about various problems that they have in the workplace, like non-payment of wages and the like. And what's remarkable is that during communism, the complaints were quite similar. So people complained about municipal services and housing.
Right before the fall of authoritarian regimes, maybe you have data on that, were these ratios high or low, extremely high or extremely low?
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking because I mean those are some of the things that emerged for me from the archives, and they were unexpected. So what I found is that as these communist regimes are experiencing economic difficulties, and as their capacity to engage in redistributive policies is restrained or constrained rather, the willingness of citizens to complain declines. So objectively, citizen frustration increases, right? It's, their economic difficulties, they're increasing shortages. There's restructuring of the economy. There is the introduction of the notion of unemployment and all of that. So citizens are not getting happier as we're moving to the second half of the 1980s. And the economic situation is deteriorating both in China and in Eastern Europe, but the volume of complaints declines. So this, of course, is counterintuitive. But when we think about the relationship between complaints and protests, it is fully logical because the volume of complaints declines, but the number of protests increases. And citizens are exiting the complaint system where they transmit information about their grievances in regularized, predictable ways to the regime, and they're going in the street where things can get out of control. And what is relevant for me is that, in the archives, both in China and in Eastern Europe, the East European example is from Bulgaria, this understanding of the volume of complaints and what it reveals to the regime, this is something that emerges from the archives. So there's a quote in my book, and this quote is from Bulgaria, where the Bulgarian dictator is told that there are no complaints. And Todor Zhivkov says, okay, well, this can mean two things. One is that people are completely satisfied and they really have nothing to complain about. And this is in the second half of the 1980s as the economy is deteriorating. So that's one possibility. They're satisfied. They have nothing to complain about. Or alternatively, they no longer trust us, so they're not complaining. So this issue of trust, the willingness to transmit information about your grievances to the regime in the expectation that the regime will solve them and will give you what you need is something that emerges from the archives for me. This is how communist regimes understood complaints. And this is something that I also have evidence from China about this particular understanding of the value of complaints as an indicator of citizen willingness to participate in the system. And of course, trust is, it's a loaded term, but I mean, this is the term that is used both in Chinese and in English. And, we can have arguments, well, does it really translate? Both in Chinese and in Bulgarian. This is the term that is used. And we can have arguments about, how well it translates into English. Can you really trust an authoritarian regime? But that's the word that the regimes themselves use about the value of these complaints. So citizens participate in the system, they transmit their grievances, which means that they're willing to abide by the rules. And when responsiveness is low, they go out into the street.
What other key indicators or ratios are there for measuring public opinion?
Well, there is the actual opinion polling, I am.
But maybe quantitative? Other quantitative factors?
Well, so with the opinion polling, that if it's conducted according to scientific standards, it is quantitative. But so on the opinion polling, right, I'm generally skeptical about its value, especially under conditions of high levels of fear when citizens are asked about their support for the party directly. But what we observe in the 1980s and also in contemporary China, especially in the last decade, is that levels of fear are generally declining. So opinion polling reveals high levels of criticism of the regime than in previous time periods. So opinion polling has become quite interesting, even for a skeptic like me. So opinion polling is certainly an indicator. Complaints are an indicator. And
can I interrupt real quick?
Yeah.
Opinion polling, is there a standard question? Meaning maybe how do you like the government or else? Is there standard questions?
Right. I mean, it of course varies from country to country, and it varies over time. But there is a question: do you support the central government? And that is a question that, of all the ways to assess support for the regime, it's probably the least informative, because when that question is asked directly in an authoritarian setting, citizens are likely to misrepresent their level of support. There are other ways to ask. There are questions that one could ask about specific government policies. Those are less sensitive. There are also questions that one could ask not about the central government, but about local levels of government. Again, this is less sensitive. So this is something that opinion pollsters in communist, but also in other authoritarian settings, they learn this over time, and they learn what types of questions are more likely to elicit genuine, what types of questions are more likely to elicit answers that are less subject to preference falsification. There's always some preference falsification, but certain types of questions under certain settings of high levels of fear are likely to result in high levels of preference falsification. So in terms of the mechanisms that can be used to assess public opinion, I mean, of course, there is the information that citizens voluntarily transmit in the form of complaints. Opinion polling, I argue, in many instances is coerced. I mean, we normally think of opinion polling as, okay, so citizens volunteer. But when levels of fear are high, citizens may not trust that the answers that they give to opinion polling questions will in fact be kept anonymous. And this is something that emerged during interviews that I did for the book with opinion pollsters from the former East Germany, but also from Bulgaria. And what they told me is that it was very difficult for them in the 1970s and in the 1980s to convince the participants in opinion polling that this is actually going to be, that this is anonymous and that their responses cannot be linked to them. All right, so we have complaints, which are voluntary. We have opinion polling, which is a little bit mixed, and oftentimes citizens consider it to be something that is coerced. So their participation is not always voluntary. And then we have mechanisms which are truly involuntary. So information is collected about citizens that can reveal their level of opposition to the regime, but it is collected from them against their will. And here come the various intelligence agencies, which of course exist in autocracies, as we discussed earlier today. And they have a very extensive network of operation, which relies on full-time employees, on sophisticated technology. Of course, technology evolves over time, so sophisticated for its time. And then also on informants, so citizens who spy on other citizens.
So why do you still need informants when in China, for example, I think I can't say how many, but there are a lot of cameras, for example, and with Snowden, there were shown that there are other ways to get information as well via technology. Why do you need informants?
Great question. Nobody knows how many cameras there are in China, but we do know that their numbers keep increasing all the time. Hundreds of millions, that's one estimate. Nobody has said 1 billion cameras, right? But, hundreds of millions. How many of them work? That's a big question mark. But what the cameras give you is information that is not sufficiently precise. And this is also what the computer algorithms give you. So, somebody is doing something that may look suspicious. You don't know whether it actually is suspicious until you're able to collect other types of information on this individual. And you do need humans who can give you the finer grained information that would help you to interpret the images that you have collected or the data on this person's social media activity. So what I observe in my book, and I documented, is that the number of informants has actually increased just as the penetration of technology in China has increased. So more technology gives you more data, but in order to interpret the data, you need human beings who can actually help tell you what the data means and what these images mean. So that's one of the findings in my book.
How many informants are there in roundabout?
This is a tough question to answer because, of course, the government doesn't publicize these numbers. So what I'm using is actually the result of an opinion poll. I mean, so here I come, right? The skeptic about opinion polling, but there is one opinion poll where citizens asked a question: have you volunteered to be a visible public informant in the last year? And this is a nationally representative survey, and from this data, I estimate that about 3% of the population in China were visible informants. So what we don't know is, and this is just for 1 year, and then for other years I'm using other sources of data, not opinion polling, but they reveal similar trends. So what we don't know is the share of secret informants. There are various estimates, and I go over those in my book. Some of them come from actual documents. Others come from scholarly research. So the percentage of informants, about 3% visible informants, and then some percentage of secret informants. We oftentimes think that East Germany during communism was the most densely penetrated society in the world. And what's relevant here is that, of course, there are different estimates of the share of informants in East Germany, but they vary between 1.5 and 2% of the population. So if China has 3% and higher than that, this makes it the most heavily penetrated society with informants in the communist world. And this is happening just as cameras and algorithms are increasingly available. So what is the actual share of informants? That's a question that nobody can truly answer, right? So there are different estimates. But what is relevant is that they have not disappeared. And in fact, if anything, they're more important now when technology is becoming more prevalent.
Very interesting. How does does that process look like? What does a typical day of an informant look like? I mean, you.
I think on that. I mean, our capacity to know. Well, so there are different kinds, right? So I mean, that's one way to answer that question, right? So they're the visible and then they're the secret. The visible informants actually wear armbands and they patrol the streets, or they patrol their neighborhoods, and they come across information about various irregularities that is then transmitted to the police and to the other authorities or to the party, right? So the idea of a visible informant is being around the neighborhood and keeping his or her eyes open about what is going on.
And how does he report it?
How is it reported? Using apps normally.
Okay.
Yeah. So because I mean, of course, with the apps and then there are centralized mechanisms for compiling the information that is transmitted through these apps and then analyzing it. It just makes it easier for those who are receiving the information, which is the police and the party. So a day in the life of a visible informant is relatively boring. A day in the life of a secret informant is, of course, a different story. And when it comes to the secret informants, there are many different kinds, and they tend to have more specific tasks rather than just walking around the neighborhood or in the streets of a city and looking for irregularities. So. In East Germany during communism, there were over a dozen different types of secret informants. And China, of course, has a range of them. So every communist regime has a range of secret informants. And they have more specific tasks. They also get better compensation than the visible informants. And they're also running a higher risk because, of course, they can be exposed. And then they can get into trouble.
How reliable is that information from the informants in comparison to those opinion polls, for example, where you not necessarily can trust them?
Yeah. How reliable is the information? One thing that we keep hearing about in societies where former informants have been exposed as informants is that they just made up their reports. You do hear that in the context of East Germany. You hear it when they're high-profile informants elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And there's, of course, the possibility that people make stuff up. But your question is, how reliable is it in comparison to the opinion polling? And where I stand on opinion polling is that people misrepresent their support for the regime because they're afraid. So, in fact, it would be a fascinating project to come up with some type of a quantitative estimate of the share of secret police informant data that is made up versus the relative frequency of preference falsification. So I actually have never thought of it that way compared to opinion polling. My sense is that it would be more accurate at the secret police. And the reason for that is that information is always cross-checked when we're dealing with informants. So the secret police does not rely on a single informant. If it's a high-level target, there are multiple informants, and they're all asked to collect information. There are full-time employees that are assessing the value of this information and its quality. So, that doesn't mean that incorrect information will not get in, but the evaluation of the quality of that information, the assumption that secret police have that informants may lie. They actually distrust the informants, which is why they have multiple informants and they cross-check and analyze the information. I feel that this is there on purpose, and it's there as a way to improve the accuracy of the information that is collected.
The value of the information, I would assume, increases with the individual that is selected, and I wonder how that is being done. Like, who will be chosen as an informant?
Yeah, this is a great question. Timon, I'm having the sun that is blinding me. So do you think you're going to edit this, correct?
Usually they are long form, no edit, so no cuts.
No edit.
Usually they are, but you can quickly close the window or so. I can edit that out, of course.
I'm just going to move myself into a different part of my office. Right. So, do you want to ask a question again on how they're chosen, or should I just answer it?
Yes. How are these informants chosen?
Right. The informants are chosen based on certain characteristics that they have. So if you're a visible informant who is patrolling your neighborhood, you are normally a relatively older person who knows your neighborhood and your neighbors quite well. A lot of these informants tend to be female, and they tend to be retired. And retirement age in communist regimes is something that occurs early in life, mid-50s for women. So they have time and they have knowledge of the neighborhood that they can then capitalize and act as informants. Those who patrol the streets are more likely to be men, again, for obvious reasons. But the visible informants are less interesting than the ones that are clandestine. So the clandestine informants are, again, chosen because they have a certain skill or certain characteristics. So if you want somebody to spy on intellectuals, this person will most likely be an insider. So he or she will be an intellectual. If you want somebody to spy on criminals, the person that you choose will be somebody with a criminal background. So in fact, we find that some of the informants that focus on criminal activity, and actually state security in communist regimes didn't just hunt political dissidents. They also investigated certain types of economic crime. So the informants that focus on criminal activity tend to be former criminals. So they're chosen with the idea that they will be able to collect specific types of information, and then the quality of the information that they collect is routinely checked and evaluated. The other feature of these informants is that they're not informants for life. They normally serve for a period of time, and then their files are closed. The information about them stays in the system. So this is why we have some interesting cases, such as a certain Agent Bolek, who is also Poland's first democratically elected president. So Lech Wałęsa functioned as an informant for the Polish state security during communism. And he denied that fact until a file was eventually made available after the Minister of the Interior passed away, and he had the communist period Minister of the Interior. He had taken that particular file home, and then his wife tried to sell it to the research institute that analyzed the state security files, and she was told that no, this file will not be bought from her. She actually has to hand it over. So the file indicated that Lech Wałęsa was an informant for state security. And what's relevant here is that he did that for a few years in the 1960s. Why was he chosen? He was chosen because he was already, it was obvious that he had dissident tendencies. So he was a high-value asset for state security. He could inform on others in those dissident circles and allow state security to have better information about the activities that they were planning. How do we deal with the fact that the first democratically elected president of Poland was a state security informant? That's a tough question. This is why he kept denying this for over 20 years, and eventually incontrovertible evidence emerged.
I've one separate question. I heard about this in one of your podcasts you did with, I think, with the UN Council on. No, I don't know the name. I'm sorry. You mentioned in Bulgaria they monitor dreams. Can you explain that?
Yes, you did ask about what are the other mechanisms for collecting opinion polling. For evaluating public opinion. And I thought that if I don't get to dreams, you might ask me about them. Yes, because of course dreams are such an unusual source of information. And there are concerns that people have in autocracies that their dreams might be monitored. There is a book about dreaming in the Third Reich where a psychiatrist in Germany, in the Third Reich, encountered patients that were very concerned that even dreaming, this extremely private activity, may be something that is monitored by the state. But there's no indication that dreams were being monitored in the Third Reich. And then there is a very influential book by Lisa Wedeen about Syria. And there, again, there is this fear that a soldier expresses that, like his dreams might be monitored. But, those accounts are anecdotal. we don't have actual evidence. But the Bulgarian archives reveal there's one report, and the report is about subversive dreams that peasants were having during the period when land is being collectivized in Bulgaria. And the subversive dreams are that they're going to eat their cows instead of give them to the state, and that they're not giving their land over to the state. So what does one do with that? It's very hard to work with dreams, which is why we just have this one single report that emerges from the archives. And these dreams, in the dream report itself, the report also mentions rumors. So dreams and rumors tend to be in the same category, where they reveal people's anxieties, but it's very difficult for the regime to figure out what to do with them. And with rumors, at least, they kept monitoring them. But the dreams, it seems that this was, from the point of view of intelligence collectors, a waste of their effort. When it comes to rumors, so rumors are used as a technique for evaluating anxieties in communist regimes. Over time, regime insiders began to be interested not just in any rumor, but in representative rumors, so typical rumors. And these typical rumors remained fairly constant in communist regimes. So, for instance, in Bulgaria, there was, from the 1960s onward, a rumor about raising the retirement age, and the retirement age was never raised during communism, so it remained 60 for men and 55 for women. There were also persistent rumors about price increases, and communist regimes tried to maintain price stability. So increasing prices was of course something that was politically very difficult for communist regimes, even if it made economic sense. And I also have evidence of rumors being tracked in China, but this capacity to track representative rumors emerges slowly and over time. So I have an extensive source of information on China from the initial 16 years of communist rule, day by day, this classified internal newspaper for the leadership. So there are hundreds of rumors in this particular source, but they tend to be random. So in this or that province, there's a rumor about this or that, rather than these are the typical rumors, these are the typical anxieties of the people. So this capacity to track representative or typical rumors emerges later on in the lifespan of communist regimes as the information collection systems become more sophisticated.
You just mentioned in the beginning psychotherapists, and I wonder, are they allowed to give information that they from their clients?
Well, in a communist regime,
Yes.
nobody is safe. But the therapists that I mentioned are this is a case in the Third Reich, right? So I mean, I don't work on Nazi regimes, but yeah, surely. I mean, in the communist world, psychotherapy or forced psychiatric treatment was something that was used against dissidents. It is a technique that the Soviet Union relied on, but as did other communist regimes. Yeah, I mean, so if a psychiatrist is responsible for forced psychiatric treatment against dissidents, then he or she certainly produce reports on the political leanings of those individuals. But this is not something that I've analyzed systematically.
Also wondered, in market research, for example, it is typical before launching an advertising campaign to do focus groups where you test for different advertisements. Is that something that is being done in these regimes as well for policies, or maybe just or statements, or maybe just the way that they are formulated?
Well, so China has a notice and comment system. When legislation is being proposed, there is a period of time, usually a few months, sometimes 6 months, sometimes shorter than that, during which citizens are encouraged to send feedback on this proposed law. how seriously the feedback is taken is, of course, an empirical question. But this feedback is solicited. And this is not unique to China. Communist regimes brag whenever there's a new constitution, for instance, or an amendment of the constitution. They say, and we got 10 million suggestions and proposals. I have not looked at that particular issue. I mean, the legislative amendment proposals and the constitutional amendment proposals. I know the numbers. I don't know whether I trust them. But the general, and I need to qualify this. I don't know whether I trust the exact statistic of, let's say 10 million suggestions. I mean, of course, they did take suggestions from the public. Focus groups, I'm sure they were used somewhere, but I mean, this is not something that I have done research on.
Okay. Now, since you have done a lot of research on all these kind of different systems and how they conduct their information, where do you think it's your personal opinion? Where do you think it starts to become unethical?
This is a great question. Where does it start to become unethical? Well, I think when it comes to complaints, we have an easier case because if I complain about something, I reveal information to the government about my grievance. And these complaints tend to be about material benefits. They're not about political matters. Of course, I mean, there is the possibility of retaliation against complainants, but communist regimes are aware of that possibility and they try to limit it because they know that if there is the fear of retaliation, the level of complaining will decline, and then the likelihood of engaging in protests would just increase. So I feel with complaints, we don't really have such a serious concern about ethics. But then, of course, involuntary extraction of information from people. So even like listening into people's conversations, which is called the spontaneous registration of public opinion. I mean, because you were asking, what are the mechanisms? Well, I mean, listening into people's conversations, is that ethical? It's a tricky case. Certainly reading people's mail, I mean, that of course is unethical. Listening into a phone conversation rather than, I mean, I think a conversation in public, perhaps, I mean, if people are just chatting, I mean, and if there are others around them, if they're not using a hushed voice, presumably, I mean, they may think that, somebody's going to overhear. So maybe it's not super secret. But, a phone conversation, I mean, there is the expectation of privacy. A written communication, whether it's a traditional letter or email, there's the expectation of privacy. Recruiting your spouse to spy on you. I mean, there are some cases from East Germany which are very high profile, but East Germany did not patent this particular technique. And, lovers and friends and spouses were recruited throughout the communist world and continue to be recruited to spy on certain individuals. So I do feel that when it comes to the involuntary extraction of information, there's, of course, a very serious ethical concern. And when people voluntarily transmit information, especially about their socioeconomic grievances, I feel the ethical concerns are limited. And then there might be information that falls somewhere in the gray zone, like these public conversations. I don't quite know, what one would make of that in terms of ethics. But the public conversations are not particularly informative, right? So because the identity of individuals is rarely ascertained. So somebody said something when they lined up, during a period of shortages, they criticized the regime. Well, okay, I mean, or somebody made a joke, and the particular somebody, the identity of the person is not known. Or there was an overcrowded bus and an informant for state security for the Communist Party who engaged in the so-called spontaneous registration of public opinion overheard something. So in case like that, if we cannot link the statement to a particular individual, I feel that this is transmitting valuable information to the regime. People are unhappy because the bus is overcrowded or because there are meat shortages. Riots might emerge in Poland, for instance. There were a lot of riots that were linked to the lack of meat or increasing the price of meat. So this is a great question. So I think where I would come, where I think my final answer on that would be that the involuntary extraction of information certainly crosses numerous ethical lines. The voluntary provision of information, many fewer.
Now, before we go to our second segment, a quick few rapid-fire questions. I would like to ask you, is there anything I should have asked that I didn't, or anything else you want to add?
Well, you didn't ask me about my method of archival ethnography, which is, that is, in terms of what I do in this book, the book is based on formally classified government-generated documents. And what I'm arguing is that I read them using a particular technique. And this technique is immersion in these government documents with the idea of uncovering their the internal logic that the information collectors develop over time when they think about systems for collecting information about popular opinion. And what emerges from these documents is a very different logic from the one that we have in the scholarly literature. So, for instance, first of all, these internal documents show that the dictator's dilemma is a real problem, but it's also a problem that can be solved. It can be solved by collecting information. But the avenues that communist regimes develop for collecting this information are very different from the ones that are emphasized in the literature that believes that the dilemma can be solved. So that literature emphasizes the value of elections, the value of protests, the value of opinion polling, and the value of commercial investigative media reporting. And I argue that these mechanisms reveal information both to the masses and to regime insiders. So my method of archival ethnography reveals what communist insiders themselves wanted to read, how they acquired it, and what they did with it once they had that information. So I think that may be the one issue that we didn't talk about, which is what did I do with these documents, and how did I read them, and what did they reveal for me? And what they revealed is this internal logic that regime insiders develop in terms of thinking of this problem of popular discontent.
Thank you very much. Then with regards to your time and your lighting situation, I will quickly go over the rapid-fire questions. I would be grateful if you could answer them in around about 2 to 3 sentences. And yes. You don't necessarily have to answer about your research or about your book, but maybe just what comes to your mind. If you had a big poster, let's say on Times Square, everybody would see it. What would you write on it?
Democracy is the greatest form of rule.
Do you have a favorite quote?
No.
Or one that you really like?
Oh my goodness. One that I really like.
If something comes to mind. If not, I will just move on.
Nope. I think let's move on.
A controversial opinion, I believe what almost nobody else does.
Well, not too many people believe that communist regimes had good systems for collection of information, and that they took popular complaints seriously. That still remains a controversial opinion. And my arguments that there was a socialist welfare state, that is something that is still controversial. So I feel that on that I actually do believe, and there is strong empirical evidence to support my belief. This is still a relatively controversial opinion.
What is your newest, biggest insight?
My newest, biggest insight is linked to a book that I am finishing, and this is a book about party building. China is still a communist regime, and this again is perhaps a controversial opinion, because a lot of scholars focus on economic development, and they believe that China is a country where the private economy is dominant. And what I'm working on is something called party building. So developing the structures of the Chinese Communist Party and creating such structures in private firms, in non-governmental organizations, and in other civil society groups. So I very strongly believe that the Chinese Communist Party, understanding the Chinese Communist Party, is central to getting insights about contemporary China.
What would you have liked to know when you were 20?
I don't know about 20, but when I was 10, this was 1985. So I think if I knew that communism would collapse in 89, I probably would have had a very different childhood. So when I was 20, I was a second-year student in college. I don't know. So for me, the big change was when I was 14, and communism collapsed in 89. Yeah, if I knew when I was 10 that communism would collapse in 4 years, that would probably lead to a different. Certainly, my life would be different. Yeah. So I think 10 rather than 20. If I knew that communism would collapse, yep.
Okay, wait, let me think about how I best phrase this. What's the biggest problem in your area you currently see? What's the biggest problem you see when it comes to information gathering from states?
So this problem depends on the quality of technology. And in the contemporary world, where cameras are cheap and computers are ubiquitous, there is a vast amount of information. But this information is not always sufficiently granular. So the biggest problem from the point of view of a communist regime is how to get more granularity in the information that it collects on its citizens. Historically, though, at earlier stages in the development of communist regimes, the problem was to collect any information, right? Because technology was not sufficiently developed. So, so the biggest problem today is sifting through the vast amounts of low-quality information that regimes have. And in order to do that, they need human informants. And they need those individuals to be numerous and of high quality.
How would you spend $10 billion to make the world a better place?
I would invest in education. That of course is the key concern. We still have parts of the world where there are high levels of illiteracy, and as we all know, this tends to be a gendered phenomenon. So on that, I think I have a very, very clear answer. Education. Especially educating women who disproportionately suffer from the current situation.
Well, thank you very much. That was it. I'm really grateful to have you had you as a guest here. It was really interesting, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Timon. It was a lot of fun. The lighting situation was not optimal, but there we are. Thank you.
That's no problem. Oh, is there anything else you want to maybe promote? A message, like I said, something to promote, something else you want to add, something you want to say? Obviously, your book, A Dictatorship and Information. And what will be the title of your new book? Do you already know that?
Yes, I do. It's called The Adaptability of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is a short book. It's called An Element. The book just focuses on how the Chinese Communist Party reacted to 1989, both 1989 in China, but also 1989 globally. So globally, that's the collapse of communism, and then domestically, it's the Tiananmen Square protests. So I'm looking at several different adaptations that the Chinese Communist Party has implemented since 1989, and I assess how successful they have been, and then I engage in some prognostication about their success in the future.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.